When Wehrmacht soldiers first glimpsed American troops hauling strange metal cylinders across North African beaches, their reaction was immediate and dismissive. Laughter rippled through their ranks. This crude contraption, barely more than industrial piping with rudimentary wiring, was supposed to threaten their armored divisions. The notion seemed preposterous to veterans who'd conquered nations behind steel and firepower. They dubbed it the plumber's friend, a clumsy American gimmick destined to fail. Within a handful of days, that mockery would transform into something far darker, genuine dread. The pipe would reveal capabilities no one had anticipated. November 1942 marked the beginning of Operation Torch, America's inaugural major assault in the Second World War. Waves of young soldiers flooded onto the shores of French North Africa, most having never heard a shot fired in anger. These weren't hardened warriors forged in prior campaigns. They were farmhands and factory workers, barely out of training, thrust suddenly into the furnace of modern warfare. General Eisenhower had greenlit the invasion, but as transports churned toward hostile shores, a troubling reality nodded him. This experimental weapon, hastily manufactured and distributed, remained virtually unknown to the men expected to wield it. Hardly anyone had discharged one. Even fewer believed it would function when their lives hung in the balance. Whispers circulated that the device posed greater danger to its operator than any adversary. Picture yourself as a teenager aboard a rolling ship, salt spray stinging your face, diesel fumes thick in your lungs. Clutched awkwardly in your grip is this 6-foot metal anomaly you've scarcely touched during drills. Stories filter through the ranks. Sometimes it launches, sometimes it sputters pathetically, sometimes it detonates prematurely. Yet officers assure you this represents your defense against Rommel's armor. This psychological burden alone could crush morale. This wasn't reassurance. It was gambling with existence itself. Meanwhile, German confidence remained unshakable. Their panzers had steamrolled across Europe with mechanical precision. The suggestion that some ungainly American pipe could genuinely threaten these iron behemoths seemed laughable. Throughout Algerian and Moroccan settlements, German and Vichy commanders exchanged skeptical glances when intelligence mentioned this supposed wonder weapon. They dismissed it as Allied propaganda, a transparent morale-boosting fabrication. One tank officer allegedly remarked that sending children into battle with fireworks would prove equally effective. The myth of panzer supremacy continued unchallenged. But battlefield myths crumble quickly under fire. The landings commenced amid thunderous chaos. Gunfire crackled like violent static, and tracer ammunition painted arcs across darkness. And American infantry poured into olive groves and dry ravines throughout Tunisia. Here, among ancient gullies and narrow dirt passages, the metal tube would face its baptism. Initial attempts appeared catastrophic. Rockets fizzled or veered wildly off target. Operators froze in terror. Some teams simply abandoned their equipment entirely, reverting to familiar rifles and fragmentation grenades. German armor rolled forward inexorably, engines bellowing, treads chewing earth to dust. The ground trembled. For countless Americans, this became the moment when war's true nature crystallized. Not exercises back home, but annihilation bearing down inside unstoppable machines. Yet certain soldiers held position. Two-man teams crouched in irrigation ditches and behind crumbling stone barriers, fingers trembling as they struggled with the unwieldy ammunition. The loader's task? Slide the projectile home, shout confirmation, drop flat. The gunner's burden? Maintain steady aim, engage the trigger, hope desperately. At distances under 50 yards, they waited with hammering hearts until enemy vehicles loomed near enough to distinguish individual rivets. Then came the hiss, the smoke trail, the streak of flame. The tube announced itself to history. When that initial rocket penetrated a panzer's side plate and ripped through with its shape-charged detonation, the psychological impact proved staggering. A machine Germans considered untouchable suddenly stood immobilized. Interior fragments shredded steel and flesh indiscriminately. Smoke erupted from hatches as crew members, if fortune smiled, scrambled out coughing and seared. For observing infantrymen, it was revelation. The pipe had delivered. The joke had killed a tank. Intelligence spread through American positions like brushfire. Maintain proximity, allow them to approach, target vulnerable flanks. Soldiers repeated these principles like sacred doctrine. The weapon remained far from perfect, plagued with persistent flaws, but it was legitimate. It could transform hopeless encounters into survivable confrontations. German laughter died, replaced by the sounds of rending metal and engines failing in choking dust. This was merely the opening act. The tube had proven itself once. Whether it could sustain that performance through brutal subsequent engagements remained uncertain. That question would be answered in flame and casualties across North African battlegrounds. On the eve of Operation Torch, Dwight Eisenhower convened with his staff amid mountains of documentation and unfurled tactical maps. The room hung thick with tobacco smoke. Known for his composure and talent for maintaining unity, that evening something jolted his confidence. Reports indicated most soldiers heading into combat had never discharged the weapon he was depending upon. The supposed secret advantage was, for the majority, a complete unknown. Eisenhower pressed fingers to his temples, muttering about sending boys against armor with equipment they'd never operated. Silence filled the room. Several officers attempted reassurance. Preparation had been abbreviated, time scarce, the invasion couldn't be postponed. The general leaned back, staring at the ceiling. He understood war offered no rehearsals. For ground troops, that training deficiency was painfully evident. Private First Class Henry Collins from Ohio later recounted that his first physical contact with the launcher came the day before hitting the beach. A sergeant barked orders. "You two, here is your pipe. Figure it out." Instructions came rapid and crude. Load the projectile, align the sights, squeeze. That was the extent of it. No live firing, no rehearsals under simulated stress, just verbal guidance. Henry recalled whispering to his companion, "We're expected to halt tanks with this thing?" The device itself combined crudeness with ingenuity, a 6-foot steel cylinder with battery-powered ignition, launching fin-stabilized rockets tipped with shaped charges. It weighed roughly 15 pounds, manageable for 2 men, but cumbersome in confined spaces. The backblast posed serious hazards. Position yourself incorrectly behind it, and you'd suffer burns or worse. Even operators questioned its safety. One soldier joked darkly that if the projectile didn't eliminate the enemy, it would certainly eliminate them. Beneath the gallows humor lurked genuine apprehension. Germans harbored no such concerns. To them, the concept of American infantry wielding rocket launchers seemed absurd. Intercepted dispatches later revealed German officers scoffing at intelligence reports of handheld tank killers. They'd confronted British anti-tank rifles and French small-caliber guns, none presenting serious threats to panzer divisions. The American tube, they assumed, would prove similarly ineffective. Panzer IIIs and IVs boasted armor sufficient to deflect rifle rounds and even artillery at extended ranges. What could a skinny cylinder accomplish in infantrymen's hands?
Aboard transport vessels approaching the Algerian coastline, soldiers crowded below decks amid piled equipment. The launchers lay stacked in crates, paint still fresh, oil scent clinging to metal surfaces. Some men pried open crates with curiosity, running hands along smooth cylinders. Others regarded them with suspicion, as if handed instruments of their own destruction. One Marine scoffed that this contraption was supposed to save them. His companion shrugged. "Suppose we'll discover the truth soon enough." When landings commenced, inexperience manifested immediately. Teams struggled assembling their equipment under hostile fire. Some couldn't properly seat ammunition. Several misfires left soldiers exposed, while German machine guns shredded the beachhead. Terror spread rapidly. Without confidence, the launcher became merely extra burden. Men discarded them, choosing to engage with trusted M1 rifles and grenades, but those couldn't stop armor. Still, Eisenhower's calculated risk had planted seeds. Amid early chaos, a handful of teams persisted with the strange weapon. They practiced in dirt behind ruined structures, fumbling until they established rhythm. One loads, the other aims. When they finally engaged the trigger and witnessed a rocket streak across terrain, hope flickered in their expressions. It was awkward, ungainly, terrifying, but it was something. By that first week's conclusion, whispers circulated through positions. Stories emerged. A tank halted cold. Germans abandoning vehicles following rocket strikes. Smoke rising from previously unstoppable machines. Soldiers leaned close during darkness, exchanging rumors around campfires. Did you hear Jones's squad eliminated a Panzer with a single shot? Others listened, eyes wide, wondering if perhaps their pipes could level the battlefield. Eisenhower remained unaware, but his uneasy gamble was yielding returns. His troops learned through fire and pandemonium. The launcher was proving itself one engagement at a time, but Germans were about to realize this toy rocket wasn't merely nuisance. It represented a genuine threat to both pride and armor. Long before Eisenhower's forces transported the pipe across North African sands, it existed only as concepts sketched on paper and experimented with in improvised laboratories. Its origins lacked glamour. It didn't emerge from mighty factories like Sherman tanks or spring from battlefield tradition like Garand rifles. Instead, it arose from desperate necessity and stubborn creativity of a small group of men. In 1942, the U.S. Army confronted grim reality. Infantry possessed no reliable method of independently stopping armor. Anti-tank rifles had proven inadequate. Hand grenades were too weak to penetrate modern plating. Even satchel charges, though deadly at proximity, demanded suicidal courage. Infantry required something portable, affordable, and lethal. The solution came from two individuals, Colonel Leslie Skinner, an ordnance engineer, and Lieutenant Edward Ewell, a young officer with improvisation talent. Skinner had been developing a shaped charge explosive, the M10 grenade. It packed sufficient power to burn through thick armor, but it was too heavy for hand throwing. It needed a delivery mechanism. That's where Ewell entered. He examined the problem, then a pile of surplus steel tubing, and conceived an idea. Why not launch the grenade like a rocket? He grabbed empty pipe, rigged a simple trigger using dry cell batteries, and constructed a crude launcher. It was supremely low-tech, scrap metal, wiring, and determination. But when they tested it and watched the rocket leap forward, they realized they'd stumbled onto something remarkable. Army leadership initially remained skeptical. The contraption resembled plumbing equipment more than weaponry. Soldiers joked it looked like a musical instrument, and when a reporter compared its whistling rocket to jazz musician Bob Burns' novelty Bazooka, the nickname adhered. Even its creators laughed at appearances, but when the shape charge blasted through armor during trials, laughter ceased. The toy had teeth. Timing proved fortuitous. With America entering war, speed mattered more than refinement. The launcher was rushed into production with almost reckless urgency. Yu later admitted he never expected his hasty prototype to survive the conflict. "We simply needed something," he recalled, "anything providing infantry a fighting chance." Factories began churning them out, simple tubes with crude wiring, paired with M6 rockets that weren't always reliable but packed deadly punch when functional. Early trials weren't flawless. Rockets misfired, batteries shorted in damp conditions, the weapon generated smoke clouds instantly revealing operator positions. Soldiers practicing joked nervously that if Germans didn't kill them, the backblast would. But despite these flaws, the concept was revolutionary. For the first time, an ordinary foot soldier could transport a weapon capable of puncturing tank armor. When news of the new weapon reached Eisenhower's command, the decision came swiftly. This pipe was going to North Africa. Perhaps too swiftly for adequate preparation. Crates of launchers were loaded onto ships bound for torch landings, paint still drying, rockets packed in straw and grease. To logistics officers, it seemed bold innovation. To young men who carry them, it appeared as gamble. Private William Nash later described his first encounter. "It was just a tube with wires, that's all. I remember thinking this can't stop armor, no way, but the sergeant ordered us to carry it, so we carried it." What Skinner and Ewell had given those men transcended mere weaponry. It was symbolism, a reminder that wars weren't won solely by massive machines and strategic planning, but through quick thinking and tools fashioned from available resources. The launcher wasn't perfect, but it was sufficient to make Germans nervous. And in warfare, sometimes, anxiety mattered as much as armor. But the genuine test would come not in proving grounds or workshops, but in dusty valleys and narrow farm tracts of Tunisia. There the launcher would meet its trial by fire, where soldiers with no training would have to trust it with their lives. In that crucible of combat, the pipe would either validate itself or vanish as another failed experiment. When initial waves of Americans flooded into North Africa in November 1942, the launcher was more legend than reality. It had been tested in workshops and demonstrations stateside, but war doesn't acknowledge blueprints. War strips concepts to bare essentials. In Tunisia's desert and scrubland, this strange pipe was about to face its trial. The terrain itself proved a harsh instructor. North Africa wasn't forgiving. Olive groves and low ridges around places like Iran and Algiers appeared peaceful from distance, but once inside them, they became labyrinths. Dry wadis cut across landscape like scars. Dust adhered to everything: uniforms, rifles, even food in soldiers' packs. And then came the tanks. The Afrika Korps and their allies understood terrain exploitation. German and Italian armor didn't advance blindly. They came with purpose. Panzer columns moving like predators along farm tracks, engines echoing off stone houses and hillsides. To American infantry, it felt like attempting to halt a thunderstorm with an umbrella. That's where launcher teams entered. 2 men, usually younger soldiers, were assigned the weapon. One carried the tube, the other hauled rockets in canvas bags. It wasn't glamorous duty. The tube was awkward, nearly 6 feet long, and ammunition was heavy. But when tank rumbles drew close, those 2 men suddenly carried an entire squad's hopes. Corporal James Riley remembered crouching behind a low wall outside a Tunisian farmstead. His loader Private Martin was beside him. They had never discharged a live round in training. Their sergeant's instructions: get close, 50 yards or less, side armor, not front, if it jams, evacuate. That was their crash course in anti-tank warfare. Riley admitted later, "We feared the pipe more than the tank. At least we knew what the tank would do."
First encounters were chaotic. Launchers misfired, rockets fell short, sometimes backblast nearly scorched the loader. In one account, a team fired at a Panzer only to watch the rocket bounce harmlessly off the turret and spin into a ditch. The crew laughed, revved their engine, and continued rolling. For observing Americans, it was humiliating. But soldiers learn quickly when survival is at stake. They began adjusting. Conceal in gullies, wait until the tank presents its flank, fire in pairs if possible. Don't panic when the rocket hisses and smokes, it's supposed to. Gradually, they began seeing results. One evening near Taborba, a squad lay pinned in a field as 2 German tanks advanced. Riley and Martin dragged their launcher into position, shaking so badly they could barely maintain steady grips. Martin shoved a rocket into the tube, slapped Riley's shoulder, and dropped flat. Riley breathed hard, aimed at the lead tank's side, and pressed the trigger. The rocket streaked across the field, struck with a flash, and the Panzer ground to a halt. Smoke poured from the hatch as the crew bailed out, stumbling and coughing. For the squad, it was like witnessing a miracle. "Did you see that?" one soldier shouted. "It worked." The second tank swung its turret, searching for the source. Riley fired again, missed wide, and scrambled back with Martin before the tank's machine gun stitched the wall they'd been hiding behind. Still, the message was clear: the launcher could work. From then on, word spread like wildfire. Soldiers passed along techniques in hushed voices at night. Aim low, flank shots, don't waste them on frontal armor. They began trusting the pipe, not as a perfect weapon, but as a lifeline. Germans, however, were noticing too. Reports trickled back that American rockets had crippled tanks. Initially, they dismissed it as luck, bad luck for crews caught off guard. But incidents kept accumulating. For the first time, Panzer commanders began wondering, could these awkward American tubes actually threaten the backbone of their advance? But for Americans, victory came at a steep price. Misfires still occurred. Operators were vulnerable.
Once you fired, the smoke pointed straight to your position. Many launcher teams never got a second shot. They were hunted down with machine guns or obliterated by shells. Yet they kept dragging the tubes into place because without them, infantry had no chance. Every time a rocket hit home, morale surged. For young soldiers who felt crushed by the legend of German armor, the launcher was more than a weapon. It was proof they could fight back, proof that the giants weren't invincible. But the war wasn't going to let them celebrate for long. The real test was still coming in the brutal chaos of Kasserine Pass. Every weapon earns its reputation in a single moment. For the launcher, that moment came on a washed-out track outside the Tunisian town of Taborba. It was late afternoon, the kind of desert light that made everything glare, dust swirling in the wind. The smell of diesel carried on the air long before the panzers arrived. A squad of Americans pinned down by machine gun fire clung to a ditch lined with scrub. 2 of them carried the pipe. This was their chance or their death sentence. The gunner was Private William Nash, a farm boy from Iowa who'd never been further from home than Kansas before the war. His loader, Private Anthony DeSanto from Brooklyn, was quick-witted and talkative, but now silent, his hands trembling as he slid the rocket into the tube. Neither had ever fired the thing outside a training range. Both knew that if the rocket didn't work, they'd be crushed under tracks or cut down where they lay. "Load it, Tony," Nash whispered, his eyes locked on the Panzer grinding closer. "Already in," DeSanto muttered, ducking lower. He slapped Nash's shoulder, the signal they'd agreed on. The Panzer rumbled forward, its turret swinging left, then right, machine guns rattling in bursts that sent dirt spitting up around the Americans. Nash's heart hammered. He could hear the engine straining, smell the acrid exhaust, see the heat rippling off its armor plates. He waited, finger trembling on the trigger. Too soon, and he'd miss. Too late, and the tank's gun would tear them apart. At 50 yards, he exhaled and squeezed. The tube erupted with a hiss and a jet of smoke, the rocket streaking across the short distance in a white blur. For an instant, he thought it had gone wide, but then it struck the tank square on the side plate. The shaped charge punched through, molten metal jetting inward. A muffled bang echoed inside the Panzer, followed by smoke billowing from the hatch. The tank lurched, gears grinding, then stopped. Silence hung in the air. Inside, chaos reigned. The German crew scrambled, coughing and burned, their invincible machine turned coffin. 2 men clawed out of the hatch, tumbling onto the dirt, one screaming, the other limp. The rest never made it out. For the Americans in the ditch, it was like watching the world shift. A Panzer, the monster of the desert, had just been killed by 2 trembling soldiers and a steel tube. "Holy hell, it worked," DeSanto gasped, wide-eyed. Nash didn't answer. He just stared, stunned, the tube still smoking in his hands. Around them, the squad erupted in cheers. Men slapped their helmets, laughed, shouted over the rattle of gunfire. In the middle of hell, hope had found them. But the moment didn't last long. Another Panzer ground into view, its gun turret swinging toward the Americans. "Reload, reload," someone shouted. DeSanto fumbled with a second rocket, hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. Nash tried to steady the tube, but the German crew had already spotted them. A burst of machine gun fire shredded the wall they'd been hiding behind, sending chunks of stone flying. They fired again, the rocket streaking past the tank, missing wide. "Move," the sergeant yelled. The team scrambled out of the ditch, Chico dirt spraying as rounds tore into the ground behind them. They barely made it to another fold in the earth before the Panzer's gun thundered, obliterating the spot they'd just vacated. The miracle of the first kill had been followed by a reminder: survival still meant running faster than death. Yet news of that first kill spread like wildfire through the company. Around campfires that night, men whispered the story. A launcher had stopped a tank dead in its tracks. Some swore they'd seen it themselves. Others repeated the details secondhand, but it didn't matter. The pipe had proved it wasn't just a piece of junk. It could kill. That first kill changed something deeper than tactics. It changed morale. Men who felt powerless now had a weapon that could make giants bleed. They began carrying the launcher with a new kind of pride, no longer as a burden, but as a chance to fight back. The Germans weren't laughing anymore. Commanders filed reports of tanks disabled by rockets, crews shaken by weapons they hadn't expected. For the first time, they realized the Americans carried more than rifles and borrowed courage. They carried a tool that could challenge the myth of Panzer invincibility. But as victory stacked up, so did the dangers. Each rocket's trail of smoke gave away the gunner's position. Each team that fired often had seconds to live before return fire chewed them apart. The launcher was deadly, but it was a gamble every time. And soon the Germans would turn their captured prize into something even bigger, giving birth to a weapon of their own. The first time German officers laid their hands on a captured launcher, they were baffled. It didn't look like much, just a metal tube with crude wiring, a trigger powered by batteries that looked better suited for a flashlight than for a weapon. But the battlefield reports couldn't be ignored. Tanks that had once rolled over enemy lines without hesitation were being stopped dead by American infantry armed with these awkward pipes. The Germans, who prided themselves on engineering excellence, now faced a weapon so simple it was almost insulting. And yet, it worked.
By early 1943, captured examples were shipped back to Berlin for study. German ordnance officers stripped the launchers down piece by piece, shaking their heads at the lack of polish, but nodding in grudging respect at the shaped charge warhead. "It is crude," one officer reportedly said, "but it is clever." Engineers realized quickly that the Americans had stumbled onto a concept that could not be ignored: give a single soldier the power to kill a tank. The reaction inside the Wehrmacht was mixed. Some frontline tank crews dismissed the launcher as a rare threat, insisting that careful tactics and heavier armor would make it irrelevant. Others weren't so sure. Survivors of ambushes near Taborba and Kasserine told stories of rockets streaking out of ditches, hitting side armor and leaving their panzers crippled. Crews spoke of the sudden terror of seeing smoke inside their tanks, of abandoning their machines in chaos. For men who had once trusted their armor as a shield, the launcher was a ghost that could strike from anywhere. And so the Germans did what they always did when confronted with a new threat. They copied it. They took the American design, scaled it up, and made it deadlier. The result was the Raketen Panzerbukes 54, better known to Allied soldiers as the Panzerschreck, the tank's nightmare. Where the launcher fired a 60mm rocket, the German version fired an 88mm warhead large enough to tear open the heaviest Allied armor. Its design came directly from those first captured launchers in North Africa, a backhanded tribute to a weapon once mocked as a toy. On the front lines, German soldiers' attitudes changed quickly. Where once they had laughed at the pipe, now they warned each other about its sting. Tank commanders began ordering infantry screens to walk ahead, scouting hedgerows and gullies where launcher teams might lie in wait. A panzer that once rolled boldly into a village now approached with caution, turrets scanning windows and alleys. The arrogance of invincibility had cracked. For the Americans, hearing that the Germans were copying their weapon was both unsettling and oddly satisfying. "If the Krauts are building their own," one GI remarked, "then I guess we did something right." But satisfaction couldn't erase the danger. The launcher was never a one-sided miracle. Every time a team fired, the white smoke trail gave away their position. The Germans responded fast, machine guns raking the earth, artillery zeroing in. Many launcher gunners never fired twice. The weapon gave power to the infantry, but it also painted a target on their backs. In Tunis, one squad saw both sides of that truth. They knocked out a Panzer III with a single shot, the crew fleeing in panic. But within moments, mortars rained down, killing the loader and wounding the gunner. The squad held their ground, but the price was brutal. For every tank stopped, blood was spilled. The pipe was no magic wand. It was a bargain with fate. Back in Germany, Goebbels' propaganda machine tried to downplay the new threat. Films showed panzers rolling confidently through North African towns, soldiers waving from hatches, unscathed. But the truth seeped out in the letters of tank crews. "The Americans have a new weapon," one driver wrote home. "It is small, but it burns through armor. We must be careful now." The Panzerschreck would soon arrive on the Eastern Front and later in Normandy, turning the tables against Allied armor. But its birth was a direct result of those first shaky shots fired by terrified Americans in Tunisia. A weapon once sneered at had forced the mighty Wehrmacht to change its ways, and in the end, that was perhaps the greatest measure of the launcher's impact. Not that it was perfect, but that it reshaped the battlefield. But before it became legend, the pipe still had to face its harshest trial yet, in the smoke and chaos of Kasserine Pass. By February 1943, the optimism that had followed America's first steps into North Africa had faded. The U.S. Army was about to meet its harshest lesson yet, Kasserine Pass. It was a narrow valley in central Tunisia, hemmed in by rocky ridges and treacherous terrain. To the men who trudged through its dust, it seemed like just another stretch of bad country. To Rommel, it was a chance to break the Green American Army wide open. The Germans came fast. Columns of panzers, half-tracks, and artillery rolled through the passes, their engines thundering like a storm. Veteran Afrika Korps troops, hardened by years of desert fighting, pushed forward with precision. The Americans, inexperienced and scattered, struggled to respond. Radios crackled with confusion, orders contradicted each other, and the lines bent under the weight of German steel. For the infantry crouched in shallow foxholes or pressed against rocky outcroppings, the sound of approaching armor was unbearable. Tracks clanked against stone, turrets squealed as they turned, and the low roar of engines carried across the valley. You could hear them before you could see them, one private remembered. It was like the earth itself was groaning. Launcher teams were thrown into the chaos. They were told to hold the passes, to make the tanks pay for every yard. Two-man crews dragged their tubes into gullies, behind boulders, into ruined farmhouses. The dust stung their eyes and the fear was constant. Each man knew that once he fired, he only had moments before the panzer struck back. Sergeant Robert Kelly and his loader, Private Lewis Carter, huddled in a ditch as a column of Panzer IVs advanced. Kelly had never fired the launcher in combat before. His hands shook as he steadied the tube on the rim of the ditch. "Load it," he hissed. Carter shoved a rocket in place and ducked. The first panzer drew near, its commander standing tall in the hatch, scanning with binoculars. Kelly pressed the trigger. The rocket shot out, trailing smoke, and slammed into the tank's side. A flash burst. The engine sputtered and the vehicle ground to a halt. The commander tumbled from the hatch, shouting to the others. The second tank swung its turret. Kelly tried to reload, but Carter was already shouting, "Move! They've got us!" A shell exploded nearby, showering them with dirt. They scrambled back, abandoning the tube, their ears ringing. The tank's machine guns swept the ditch moments later, chewing the ground to shreds. Scenes like that played out across the valley. Some launcher teams scored kills, knocking out tanks that seemed unstoppable. Others never got the chance, cut down by machine guns before they could fire or killed when rockets misfired in their hands. For every victory, there was tragedy. But what mattered was that the Americans were learning. Kasserine was brutal. Men broke under the strain. Entire units fell back in disarray. The Germans captured supplies, prisoners, even jeeps and trucks left abandoned in the dust. To many, it seemed like proof that the Americans were outmatched, that they didn't belong on the same battlefield as the Afrika Korps. Eisenhower himself was shaken, forced to admit the army had been unprepared. Yet amid the wreckage of defeat, the launcher's role stood out. Time and again, small teams had delayed tanks, forced columns to halt, bought precious minutes for infantry to regroup or retreat. A single shot fired in the right moment could turn confidence into hesitation. Soldiers clung to those small victories as proof they could stand against Rommel's veterans. One corporal recalled seeing a launcher team hold a crossroads against 3 German tanks. They destroyed the lead vehicle, forcing the others to back off long enough for reinforcements to arrive. "Those 2 boys saved us all," he said later. They didn't survive the battle, but their names were remembered long after the smoke cleared.
The Germans won at Kasserine Pass, but their victory came at a cost. For the first time, their tank crews knew the Americans had teeth. The launcher hadn't turned the tide, but it had left its mark. Rommel himself acknowledged that the Green American Army would not stay green for long. In the weeks after Kasserine, U.S. commanders studied the disaster. Training was overhauled, tactics refined, leadership reshuffled. The launcher teams, once seen as expendable, were now valued as essential. They were no longer just soldiers carrying pipes. They were the thin line between life and death when the tanks came. The pass had been lost, but lessons had been won. And those lessons would carry forward as American troops prepared not just to fight, but to match the Germans blow for blow. The dust of Kasserine had barely settled when Eisenhower and his generals gathered to make sense of the disaster. Reports poured in, units routed, supplies lost, hundreds of men killed or captured. The defeat was undeniable. But buried in the wreckage were small threads of hope.
Stories of launcher teams that had stood their ground, of tanks disabled at close range, of infantry who fought back when they had nothing else. Those threads became the starting point for a transformation. The U.S. Army was still young in this war, still learning, and the men had learned it the hardest way possible. Fear and confusion had broken lines at Kasserine, but fear also taught discipline. The Army could no longer send men into battle with weapons they didn't understand. Training changed overnight. In the weeks that followed, launchers were pulled from crates and fired again and again until soldiers no longer flinched at the smoke or doubted the trigger. Crews drilled loading, aiming, reloading, moving, until the motions became instinct. The pipe wasn't just a strange piece of gear anymore. It was part of the soldier's body. In North African camps, the lessons were written in sweat. Men carried launchers across desert ridges, fired them at rusted tank hulks, and timed themselves under the scorching sun. Sergeants barked reminders, aimed for the sides, 50 yards or less, fire and move. The training was harsh, but it gave confidence. Soldiers began to believe that with this weapon, they had a fighting chance against the dreaded panzers. Stories from the battlefield fueled that belief. Word spread of 2 privates who had stopped a German advance by knocking out the lead tank, forcing the column to turn back. Another tale told of a squad that had held a farmstead against armor until reinforcements arrived, firing every rocket they had until the walls around them crumbled. These stories weren't just rumors. They became teaching tools, examples of courage under fire. The Germans, meanwhile, noticed the change. Where before they had driven boldly into American positions, now they slowed, wary of hidden tubes waiting in gullies or behind ruined walls. Tank commanders demanded infantry screens, insisting that foot soldiers clear the way before armor advanced. Each launcher team, no matter how small, forced the enemy to hesitate. And in war, hesitation was a weapon in itself. Private Henry Collins, who had once doubted the pipe, wrote home after months of training and fighting. "It's not a toy anymore. We know what it can do now. When we hear the tanks, we don't just run. We set up, we wait, and we fight. That makes all the difference." For men like Collins, the launcher was more than steel and wires. It was courage in tangible form. But the weapon was still far from perfect. Rockets failed in damp conditions. Backblast revealed positions. Teams were hunted relentlessly once they fired. Many gunners knew their life expectancy after pulling the trigger was measured in seconds, and yet they kept firing, not because they trusted the launcher completely, but because they trusted each other. The 2-man bond between gunner and loader was unbreakable. One steadied the tube, the other kept the rockets coming. They lived or died together. And in that partnership, the weapon found its true power. Commanders began to rethink strategy. Instead of scattering launcher teams randomly, they placed them deliberately, along choke points, crossroads, and ambush sites. The pipe wasn't just a desperate gamble anymore. It became part of the Army's doctrine. Engineers worked to improve the rockets, to increase penetration, to reduce misfires. Slowly, the launcher evolved from a rushed invention into a reliable killer. And the soldiers, hardened by Kasserine, carried their new confidence into every fight. They knew now that victory didn't come from numbers alone or from fancy machines, but from learning fast and refusing to quit. The launcher was a symbol of that lesson: crude, improvised, dangerous, but effective when wielded with courage. As one officer put it after the campaign, "We bled for every yard, but we learned. And those lessons will carry us all the way to Europe." The pipe had been baptized in chaos, tested in failure, and proven in fire. It would not be forgotten. But the story was far from over. The launcher was about to earn respect not only from American soldiers, but from the Germans who once mocked it. By the spring of 1943, the jokes were gone. The pipe that had once been a punchline in German barracks was now spoken of with caution, even respect. What had started as a rushed invention had proven itself across Tunisia, and the men who carried it no longer felt like guinea pigs in someone else's experiment. The launcher had matured into a weapon both sides took seriously.
In camp after camp, American soldiers traded stories about what the weapon could do. Around mess tables and campfires, men compared scars, swapped tips, and bragged about close calls. "Don't bother with the front plate," one corporal would say. "Shoot low, behind the treads, you'll stop it cold." Another added, "Fire one, then shift positions, because the second they see that smoke, they'll zero in." It became soldiers' wisdom, passed like gospel, forged not in manuals, but in battle. And the Germans noticed. Tank commanders who once rolled boldly into villages now hung back, sending infantry ahead to flesh out ambushes. Some crews even bolted extra plates to their tanks in hopes of blunting the shaped charge warhead. Nothing spread faster through the Wehrmacht than the knowledge that American infantry could punch through armor. Respect was born of necessity, and the launcher earned it in blood. But for the men who used it, respect came at a cost. Carrying a launcher was both an honor and a curse. The tube made its bearers a target. Machine gunners scanned hedgerows for the telltale smoke trail. Snipers searched for the silhouette of a man lugging a tube across the field. Many gunners lasted only a few battles. Loaders knew that if they survived long enough, they'd inherit the weapon when the gunner fell. Yet soldiers kept volunteering. There was pride in being the one with the power to stop a tank. Pride in carrying something that gave their squad a fighting chance. Private Anthony DeSanto, the loader from Brooklyn, put it bluntly in a letter home. "They call me a walking coffin because I carry the rockets, but I'd rather that than sit helpless when a tank comes. At least this way, we can fight back." For American commanders, the change in morale was striking. The army that had been mauled at Kasserine was not the same army preparing for Sicily and beyond. Men were tougher, sharper, more confident. The launcher was only one part of that transformation, but it symbolized something larger, the moment when the Americans stopped being bystanders in the war and started becoming contenders.
Even Eisenhower, who had once worried that the pipe might be a failure, began listing it alongside the Jeep and the transport plane as tools that gave the U.S. Army flexibility and bite. He knew it wasn't perfect. He'd heard enough complaints about misfires and short range. But he also knew it had changed the balance. A single $25 tube in the hands of a scared but determined private could stall a tank column worth thousands of dollars and dozens of men. That kind of economy was priceless. On the German side, the lesson cut deep. The Panzerschreck, their copy of the launcher, was proof enough of how seriously they took the weapon. It was heavier, clunkier, but devastating. It showed how innovation traveled both ways on the battlefield. What had been born in an American workshop with scrap tubing now returned in German hands as a deadlier echo. War had a way of recycling fear. Yet even as the Germans built bigger rockets, the original launcher retained its reputation. It wasn't just about stopping tanks anymore. Soldiers used it to blast bunkers, take out machine gun nests, and knock holes in walls. Its versatility gave it a permanent place in the infantry's arsenal. The pipe had outgrown its nickname. It was no longer a curiosity, it was a workhorse. Still, for all its victories, every launcher team carried the memory of a failure or two. Misfires that cost lives, shots that missed in the heat of panic, comrades lost seconds after firing. Respect for the weapon was matched with respect for the men who dared to use it. By the time Tunisia was secured, the launcher was more than a weapon. It was a symbol, a reminder that wars weren't always won by the biggest machine or the most polished plan, but by the stubborn will of ordinary men who refused to give up, even when armed with little more than a pipe and a prayer. The Germans no longer laughed, the Americans no longer doubted, and the launcher, once mocked as a pipe, stood as proof that ingenuity and courage could change the course of battle. But its story didn't end in North Africa. Its legend would grow as the war moved north into Europe, where the stakes would rise higher still. By the time the campaign in North Africa ended and the Allies turned their eyes towards Sicily, the launcher had already written its legend. What began as an untested pipe in the hands of nervous rookies had become a trusted weapon that soldiers carried with pride. It had not won battles alone.
But it had given men the courage to stand their ground against the most feared machines of the war. In every dusty wadi, every ruined farmstead, the launcher carved its place into history. The power of the weapon was never just in the steel or the rockets. Its power came from what it represented, the idea that ordinary soldiers could fight back against overwhelming odds. For young privates who had once stared at approaching tanks with dread, the launcher was more than a tool. It was hope. Every rocket fired, every tank stopped, reminded them that no machine was invincible, no enemy unbeatable. The Germans learned the same lesson, though from the other side. Their initial laughter gave way to alarm, and alarm gave way to imitation. The Panzerschreck was born out of respect, a silent admission that even a crude invention could tip the scales. For a military that prided itself on engineering marvels, it was humbling to see American ingenuity, imperfect, rushed, and improvised, deliver such results. But perhaps the greatest lesson of the launcher wasn't about tactics or engineering, it was about resilience. War demanded adaptation, and the men who carried the pipe embodied that truth. They learned in chaos, adjusted under fire, and trusted each other when nothing else could be trusted. The bond between gunner and loader, forged in the seconds between loading a rocket and firing at a tank, was as strong as any in the war. They knew the risks, they knew their chances, and still they stood. One veteran later said, "It wasn't the weapon that mattered, it was the man willing to fire it." That sentiment echoed through the ranks. The launcher might have been a tube of steel, but in the hands of a determined soldier, it became something far more powerful, a reminder that courage could level the battlefield. When historians listed the tools that helped the Allies win, the launcher often appeared alongside the Jeep, the transport plane, and the Sherman tank. Not because it was flawless, far from it, but because it gave soldiers a way to fight back when everything else seemed lost. For every misfire, there was a tank stopped. For every team lost, there was a squad saved. For every moment of fear, there was a moment of triumph. Looking back, the story of the launcher is also a story of perspective. The Germans saw it as laughable until it killed their tanks. The Americans saw it as a burden until it saved their lives. And history saw it as one of the small, stubborn tools that helped turn the tide. From the olive groves of Tunisia to the hedgerows of Normandy, it carried with it the lesson that size is not everything, that even the smallest weapon, wielded with courage, can change the course of battle, and that lesson stretches beyond the battlefield. Life will always present obstacles that seem too big to overcome, tanks of one kind or another rolling toward us with unstoppable force. The launcher reminds us that solutions don't always look impressive at first, they may even look laughable. But when paired with determination, faith, and courage, they can stop giants in their tracks. So the next time you feel overwhelmed, remember the pipe. Remember the young men in Tunisia who faced the roar of panzers with nothing but a crude tube and steady hands. Remember that sometimes the simplest tool and the strongest will are all you need. History is written not only by generals and great machines, but by ordinary people who dare to stand and fight. The launcher was proof of that. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough.